Guys, I want to talk to you about how I cut my router table insert plate into my Unisaw side extension plate. There's several ways that you can do this to fit a router table plate into a table. The challenge is doing it without screwing it up or cutting into the tabletop so that it fits perfectly. You want a perfect fit. We don't want to screw this up. So I use a template to guide a router to do this, and this is one way to do it. There's a faster way. You can use a template, a router, and a jigsaw. I just chose to use a router for the whole thing. I like using templates to do all of this stuff. Templates basically reduce error by minimizing tedious measuring and layout. That's basically what it is. Using a template with guide strips allowed me to use a router to do this whole thing, and it allowed me to place the router base flat on the table. So that gave me a couple of things. It not only provided a better router base support, but it allowed me to be able to cut through the whole 3/4 inch table with the standard router bit. So my plan was to create a template to first cut the rabbet out for where the plate sits, and then add spacer strips to that to move the router in on all 4 sides, and then cut the hole out where the router plate and the router sit. So this video is going to show you how I went about doing this. And again, you can use a jigsaw, it's faster. It's a different way, but it's very similar. So the first step on any of this is you need to acquire a router plate, right? You got to get yourself a plate. I have a woodpecker woodworking plate. And then you need to choose your location where you're going to place the plate on your table. I chose to keep it closer to the user side versus centering it in the table because a couple of reasons. I wanted to be able to easily reach the table, the router, reach the bit, and I wanted to easily reach underneath to get to the adjustments. I don't have a crank, so I have to reach under. The other thing is having it close to me allowed me to have a good stance and balance. And lastly, one factor that I had to consider was that I was using a Rockler router table fence. And because I was not centering the router in the middle of the table, I was worried the fence would overhang. So I had to consider that the fence didn't overhang the edge of the table, so I brought it right to the edge, favoring the user side. So the final placement of location was decided based on a combination of keeping the router closer to the user and not having my router fence overhang. And the reason why I didn't want to overhang it was I didn't want it to become a hip bump or a hazard or a snag for clothing and stuff like that. So once you figure out your location, you need to mark the location. Find that perfect spot, mark the location. I brought my table saw fence right over to where I needed it to be. I locked it down, pushed my fence up against it to align it and keep it square, and then I traced all the way around. And this visual reference proved to be very helpful throughout the entire installation. I kept referring back to it. The next step is you want to measure your router bit to the base of your plunge router to make this cut. So I needed to know a couple of things. You first need to know the distance from your straight cutting router bit to the outside of the base. So you want to take that measurement. I used a 3/4 inch router bit and I measured on all 4 sides. My particular measurement on my router was 2.5 inches, and I need that later on. So again, check all 4 sides. If your measurements are off a little bit, guys, just loosen the screws of the base plate and readjust till you get it right. It's not the end of the world. You can always just use one side, make a black little marker, and keep that side as a reference point. I used a 3/4 inch router bit because I wanted to match my old situation that I had. But in hindsight, I wish I had used a 1/2 inch router bit, straight cut bit, because it better matched my router plate's corner radius. So think about that when you're doing this. I didn't. Let's talk about the template and guide strips. Making a template itself is pretty straightforward. I used 4 scrap pieces of 3/4 inch birch plywood I had laying around, long enough to span across my table. And I did that because I was eventually going to clamp it down. I placed a router plate over my trace lines to stay accurate. I ripped plywood spacer strips as well. And those spacer strips were 2.5 inches. And I placed them against the router plate on all 4 sides. Remember, the 2.5 inches was the distance from the tip of my router bit to the outside of my router base that I was using to cut this. And again, I kept referring back to my trace lines throughout making this template. and also use that table saw fence to lock everything down. So I constructed my template around this plate using my 2.5-inch spacer strips, and I then screwed the four template parts together with smaller 3/4 strips with 3 screws each to keep it from moving. While assembling the template, make sure that all the parts are snug together. Again, use your table saw fence as an anchor point to push against while you're measuring, you're cutting, and you're assembling. Once you are sure that everything is lined up and it makes sense, then what I did is I clamped down my template to the table saw table. Double checked everything again and checked for square. Keep checking this through. You don't want to screw this cut up. It's a laminate table. It's expensive. I don't want to mess it up. So now we talked about routing and getting ready for the recess. I set my router to the depth of my router table insert plate, right? Maybe a little bit stronger. My handheld plunge router has kind of an oblong shape where the handles are, and it was going to hit the template because the template sits higher than the plate. So to keep me oriented, I just put a black marker on one line in front, and I just followed that black line the entire way on all 4 sides. So you're almost ready to route now. I take the 2.5-inch spacer strips out because now I'm going to use the router in that space. And I'm going to do a dry fit. And I just basically lower it without the machine on, and I do a dry fit with it almost touching my pencil lines and just checking my lines. You know, this is important to do a dry run before you actually start cutting into the table. So after that, when you're ready to go, you got to route out the recess. And this is the rabbet that the plate will sit on. And you're going to operate the router in a clockwise fashion on all 4 sides and just checking your depth. And remember, you're cutting to the depth of your plate. I decided to cut out the center hole. I decided to use a 1/4-inch straight bit to cut that out. And I figured that the 1/4-inch bit would create less dust, and it absolutely did. So again, I had to measure the edge of that router bit to the edge of my router base, and that came out to be 2 3/4 of an inch. So I compared that measurement to the location of my cutouts to make sure it all worked out, and based on those 2 measurements, I cut 1/2-inch spacer strips that I added to all 4 sides of my template. And I made these spacer strips snug so that I had to kind of bend them and pressure fit them in. And while probably not needed, I threw a few pin nails in to make sure they stayed in place. No big deal. I probably didn't need to do that. Adding these spacer strips basically places my router cut 3/4 inches in from my template on all 4 sides. Remember, I was looking for a 3/4-inch rabbet to support my plate all the way around. So once I had that in place, I proceeded to cut out the section where the router plate sits and the router actually mounts to. So I set my router bit to 3/8 of an inch, and I made a first pass, and then I lowered it to 7/8 and made my final pass. So I did it in 2 passes. Took it out, cleaned it out with the vacuum, and did a test fit. The test fit of the router plate showed that my plate was about a 32nd of an inch high, a little bit too high. So I removed the 1/2-inch spacers. I installed my 3/4 bit again, and I just lowered it a little bit and made the rabbet cut a little bit deeper. I made a pass with the router, dry fitted it again, and it was slightly lower than the table this time, which was fine because my particular router plate has built-in set screws, Allen set screws, to adjust in and out, up and down. I use a block of wood once I've got that in, and I rub it across the table in the direction of feed and all that, and make sure that the table and the table plate are in the same plane. Once that's good, you're good to go. You're ready to mount your router to the table insert. And basically, I took the plastic base off my router, I used the same screws, and I mounted the router to the plate. Once you're done, guys, the next thing you need to do is think about a fence. I opted for a rockler fence with dust collection and some nice featherboard accessories. I used to use my table saw fence with a built-in drop-on thing that I would drop on top with dust collection. It worked great. The problem was I learned that when I was routing stuff and maybe I needed an extra piece, when I would have to take it all apart to bring my fence over to maybe use the table saw. I don't have 2 table saws. So I learned from that. So this particular fence, I decided I want my table saw left alone, and I can use my table saw up to like 36 or 42 inches before it impacts the fence anyway. And I went with this rockler fence, and it works like a charm. Guys, this has been a quick video on how I did my table saw insert plate. I hope it helps you out. It's not the only way. It's not the best way. I'm Rob Robillard. Please consider subscribing to these videos. Just click the subscribe button in the lower corner right there, and we'll see you next time. Take care.